Here
Oh,
we
thank you so
go.
much.
One, two, three. Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sino Land. Not in Shenzhen, China, but in Normandy, France, where my wife's family has their 19th century vacation home. And I am really honored to have on the show today Alex Witherspoon and John Hanchar. How are you all doing?
We're doing great, Jeff. Thank you so much for having us on the program. Pleasure
And
to be here.
And I have never had two people on the show before, so you all are the first. So I'm really excited to hear from both of you. While most young Westerners these days spend their time gorging on mindless eye candy and pop culture, Alex Witherspoon and John Hanchar have a grander vision for their existence on Earth, high hopes for humanity. Living and working in China, they have done something quite extraordinary. They have gone to visit collectivized 21st century villages to see what is happening and to let these people tell their story. Apparently, the article I wrote last year about modern day collectivization in China is an inspiration, which makes me feel honored and humble about my journalism and book writing. And their amazing cultural adventure is quite remarkable. So really appreciate you guys coming on the show and tell us about it.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Go ahead.
Really, just a bit of clarification. So, Spoon and his friend Cody, was it?
That's correct.
Yes. Alex and his friend Cody were the ones who went to the collective farms.
To the villages, yes.
I'm working with Alex now on I'm now Alex's new collaborative partner. So I wasn't involved in actually going to the farms, just to make sure that I don't want to silence Cody out of the story.
Yeah. Well, actually, in the biographies, I was going to get there, but I appreciate your Confucian humility. So your Lao-Tzu your Lao-Tzu humility. Thank you. Well, let's start with Alex. Alex was born in Hawaii to non-Hawaiian parents, and he grew up in a fairly normal middle-class household. And I love telling these stories because the fans out there are going to find out later that these gentlemen have taken an atypical political course in their lives. And so I want people to hear, when people talk about, well, gee, I joined the Communist Party of France, and apparently these young guys have become communists or socialists, and I want people out there to hear our stories because it gives them courage to break away from the mainstream mold. So Alex was in a normal middle-class household. In spite of this, he went on to enroll at the controversial alma mater of a former horticulture teacher, the Evergreen State College, in 2014. While there, Alex was both politically and academically active. He presented papers at 2 research conferences, spent 6 months in Shanghai on an exchange program, and once had the pleasure of barricading a door during a student protest. Bravo. Since completing the Bachelor of Arts program in 2017, he has worked and lived in China, dividing his time between research on Chinese rural development, a full-time recruitment job, and a side gig selling tea from small-scale producers. In coming years, he hopes to pursue his research as part of a master's program. Then we have John Hanchar, was born in the United States, and since 2005, he's lived in Canada, most recently in the city of Montreal, Quebec. Love that place. John majored in history and minored in world cinema at McGill University and graduated in 2018. During his time in Montreal, he worked for an anarchist courier cooperative. Unbelievable. Love it. And lived in and helped run a collectively organized music venue. Academically, his main focuses have been East Asian cinema. I'm going to pick your brains after the interview about that, about Chinese cinema, Yugoslav politics, and the history of mineral resource exploitation in post-colonial Africa. This is just amazing. He currently lives in China, where he works as an English teacher. Now, the town that they visit is called Haoxi. For the listeners out there, Haoxi. Haoxi was the last in a series of 3 collectivized villages that Alex Witherspoon and his original collaborator that John alluded to, Cody Hartsburg, made in 2018. Unlike their trips to Chiliying and Nanjie, these are 2 other villages, they arranged this trip beforehand with local officials, which granted them the ability to have more in-depth conversations with village residents and local party leadership. The visit itself took place between December 3rd and December 5th, I suspect, in last year. Once Cody and Alex were back home in Yangzhou, where they're based, they produced a report on Haoxi Village using the notes and audio recordings gathered during the trip. An abridged version of this report appeared in Critical Edges magazine, and I have included the link in the article here. Recently, Cody returned to Canada in his steed. John, another Canadian Marxist, has taken over as Alex's main collaborator. Going forward, John and Alex plan to make more trips and do more work in China's rural economic development. Just unbelievable. So, guys, I'm really happy to have you on the show today, and I'm anxious to hear you all talk about your story. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Well, listen, please tell us a little, first off, again, tell us a little bit about yourselves. I understand you are both communists, which in North America puts you way outside the norm, and it also is risky and definitely causes problems as far as getting jobs and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us, how did you decide to become communists? Who would like to go first?
Me? All right, so Alex. So I think what really made it possible for me was my environment above all else. I grew up in a pretty progressive household. I went to a high school on a different Vashon Island over in Washington State. That island is, I would say, famous for being the most progressive community in North America. We donated more to.
What's the name of the island, Alex? You kind of faded out.
Vashon Island, Vashon Island, Vashon Island.
Never heard of it. Okay.
Pretty small. I think it's a community of 10,000 people, so it's quite insignificant population-wise. But despite that, we donated more to Bernie Sanders per capita than any other community in the United States. We're quite lefty, you could say. And it was no surprise when many of my peers back in high school participated in the Occupy protests, which I think were a pretty watershed moment for many people in my generation. And then later when I was working downtown at a job, I had many colleagues who were identifying as anarchists or communists or socialists. And while employed there, I joined a local communist organization called Socialist Alternative. They're a relatively small.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, I think we got some notoriety when our local party branch got a member elected to the city council, Kashama Sawant. At any rate, it's a fairly active but still relatively small Trotskyist organization, mostly in the Northwest. And since then, I've been pretty committed to the communist movement. I think I've ideologically drifted a bit away from Trotsky and all that, but still very much so a Marxist, very much so a communist.
Okay, great. Well, congratulations. It takes a lot of guts to do something like that in especially Anglophone countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, England. It's a little more accepted here in Europe, but in continental Europe. But anyway, hats off to you. What about you, John?
My background is mostly from a historical perspective. Montreal, I'm lucky enough that it's a pretty, as you mentioned, you've been there, you love it. It's a great city. It's also pretty radical. I've accidentally wandered into student protests at various points. I wasn't there for the big 2012 protests. So I kind of came to a McGill that was a little bit depoliticized because a lot of the people who had been more involved in politics had kind of suffered the aftermath of 2012 when all the big protests were. I only started school there in 2013. But I was lucky enough I studied under Professor Gavin Walker, who's a Canadian Marxist historian whose main focus is Japanese Marxist intellectual history. Wow. And I got into that, and that was kind of my first involvement with it. And then mixed with the fact that I personally believe that one can find criticisms of communist movements, of communist theory through history, but one finds much more of a damning critique of the capitalist world if one is an accurate, honest historian. And so it's not so much a communism of ideological background inherently, although I do have like a relationship with wanting to study and understand the ideologies. It's more of a engaging with the mass scale pillaging and the mass violence the mass violence perpetrated by the capitalist world and seeing direct damning evidence.
Yeah. Amazing, you guys, and to think, and how old are you guys? Do you mind telling me?
Sure. I'm 22. Alex here.
And I'm 24 going on 25 in September.
Wow, that's amazing, God. And to think what I was doing when I was 22 to 25, Jesus Christ. Anyway, you all are, hats off to you. I really admire that you all had the courage to step out so early. It took my thick, brainwashed 1950s, 1960s Cold War head until I was in my 50s before I finally figured it out. So I'm really happy for you. Well, listen, I know Alex talked about going on a study course in China. Why are you in China, and how long do you all plan on staying there?
I'll go first. So China for me was actually a happy accident, or the happy outcome of an unhappy accident. When I was working at the Bike Courier Collective, I got doored by an Uber, and I busted my hand. This kid wasn't paying attention, and he opened his passenger door right into the bike lane when I was delivering Five Guys burgers and fries, and slipping into the gutter, and my hand emerged at an unnatural angle. And I was pretty messed up from it. So I went back to my parents' place in Newfoundland, and I recovered with them. And my mom was like, "Oh, you should look into being an English teacher." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And then right now with the job market in China for English teachers being like such a glut of wanting new people to come teach, it was pretty easy to get a job over here. Yeah. And I was like, "Oh, I understand China the least well of the Pacific Rim. I have most of my experiences with Japan." And I was like, okay, like I should probably spend some time understanding China. So it was like China seemed like the easiest place to get a job in. I was like, I understand China the least, so this is a good opportunity. And the pieces kind of came together, and I found myself here.
Oh, cool. And what about you, Alex?
Well, like as I think you mentioned earlier, I was studying in Shanghai for half a year on like an exchange program. So once I went back to the States to graduate, I had it in my heart to come back to China.
Okay, you fell in love.
Yeah, exactly. I worked a summer job on an apple cider mill, like filling these plastic bottles with cider, capping them and putting them into a crate. And after 3 months of that, I was pretty much ready to, for whatever China had to throw at me. So I came here.
Cool.
I initially taught English for a while, moved on to a recruitment job, and now, since we first made our original contact, I started working at a university where I'll be doing a 3-year master's program on rural development. So
they're in China.
Here in China, that's correct.
Okay, cool.
Over in the Anshi Autonomous Prefecture. It's like a
okay.
Like the Tujia and Miao people. So I'm going to be there at the university that they've set up for the ethnic minorities and be working on like a development project related to tea. So it sounds super exciting.
Wow, amazing.
So
go ahead.
I hope it's obvious that Alex is the much more serious person of the duo. I'm kind of tagging along for a lot of this.
I hope it's also equally obvious that John is a much better communicator and is naturally confident in situations like this.
And just as a time frame, John, when did you arrive? And Alex, when did you arrive? Just to kind of see how long you all have been in China.
I have been here since, it feels like forever ago, April 8th of this year.
Oh, really?
So not very
okay,
long.
So you are fresh off the boat. Wow, okay.
Fresh off the boat. I hit my 3-month anxiety spike recently, and I'm kind of just passed through that.
Okay, great. And what about you, Alex?
Let's see here. I did my exchange program, I think it was the fall of 2016 and spring of 2017. And then I came back to China in October of 2017 and have been in it ever since.
Wow, awesome, amazing. By the way, John, very few Americans have done this, but I drove from west to east all the way across Newfoundland, and then drove all the way back. It's an amazing place. Yeah. Well, listen,
It's
let's get to
beautiful.
your amazing story. About 21st century rural collectivization, or actually it's like recollectivization in China. Please give the fans out there a quick 5-minute look back at the, quote, land to the tiller movement after communist liberation in 1949, and then describe China's collectivization movement in the 1950s, and how it was mostly abandoned starting in the early 1980s. So just kind of walk us through it and give us a nice I don't 10 minutes, whatever you need to tell us about it.
Sure. So I think the first step after communist victory was the land reform. This is really like the essence of the land to the tiller campaign. And what happened during that period was the landlords had their land expropriated and then redistributed among peasant households. Now, the goal was to give each peasant 10 mu, which is about 2 acres for us Americans, such that they would be able to subsist with the land that they had in their household. I think the importance of this period was that they were able to end tenancy in rural China once and for all. So up until this point, you had landlords in various parts of China possessing hundreds, if not thousands, of mu, and there would be dozens of peasant households within this estate who would have to give part of their production, either in grain or in cash, to the landlord just to subsist. And that all came to an end by 1951, in just 2 short years. So I think we should really highlight just how enormous that change was so quickly.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And this was followed up. Yeah, this was followed up in probably the mid 50s, 53, 54, by the development of something called a low-level co-op. Within these co-ops, production and marketing was coordinated within these very loose, one member, one vote cooperative structures. Very similar to the co-ops you see in rural France today, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. Right down the road.
So yeah, I mean, just like the co-op right down the road, there would be member households who would buy in. They would invest their land, their tools, their livestock, and for this investment, they would get a certain amount of dividend. So every month or every year, they get a certain amount back from the co-op as a way of incentivizing them to keep their land, their cows, their tools, their seeds, whatever, invested in the co-op. So property rights are still preserved under this kind of co-op. Along with this, there were certain problems. I think the one which was most critical and concerning for the communist authorities was the issue of unequal competition. So just like the co-op in France or the co-ops in Yugoslavia, some co-ops had better inputs, they had better geography, they had better connections, and as a consequence, they were able to outcompete the less fortunate, which led to, of course, unequal development, primitive accumulation, and all of that. That was not what the Communist Party wanted to see, and was not what they hoped would be the consequence of land reform.
Yeah.
So, coming into 1957, 1958, collectivization really gets comes into full swing. Everybody gets organized into something called a people's commune, which is not exactly a commune, but within them there is no more competition. We no longer have individual co-ops or household farms competing on a rural market. Everyone gets organized into a state socialist planned economy, where there is no more competition between villages, households, co-ops, what have you. And within these communes, distribution is only to be done according to labor points. I think this is a really interesting development, unique to the period, and unique to China in many ways, where the amount of, say, commodities you get, or rather coupons to get commodities, is determined firstly on what they determine to be your need, right? I think an adult was reckoned to need more rice, to need more vegetables, to need more meat than a child or an elderly person. They needed more caloric intake. But aside from that, all the extra things you got was rationed according to how much work you put into the commune. And how they measured this was labor hours, which is something which Marx talks about back in Capital. And it's a super cool historical development because this is them, for the first time really in world history, making labor vouchers or labor points, labor hours, the basis of commodity distribution.
Yeah.
And so there would be a secretary and there would be an accountant associated with the commune. And it would be their job to keep track of, how much are you putting into constructing roads? How many hours are you putting into cutting hair? How many hours are you putting into field work? And then based on that, calculating the equivalency, right? How much do we value the output of cutting hair versus farm work? And for this, there was, state economists would have guidelines, but also at the local level, there was a degree of flexibility. Members had to come together and vote and agree how much.
Yeah. It was very democratic, very, very democratic.
Absolutely. I think I listened to your podcast with Jinpings Han before.
Yeah.
He's an amazing guy. Did you read his book? I think it's like The Untold Cultural Revolution.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I ordered, and I just ordered, in fact, I'm going to get Mobo Gao's newest one, where he goes back to his village, today after all the collectivization. So, yeah, they're both really superb scholars.
Yep, I completely recommend it. Anyone who wants to learn more about how the collective structure was managed at this time should definitely go and read their books. Very interesting. I think very revolutionary, too, what was being accomplished there. But anyways, another feature of collectivization, perhaps most important one for what happened later during Deng Xiaoping, was the beginning of modernization in the countryside. These included massive infrastructure projects, irrigation, you had dams being constructed, you had floodplains, dikes, you name it. But also beginning something called the experiment fields. So like each commune would have a certain amount of land that they put aside to developing seeds, to developing new cultivars, to developing new ways to fertilize, new ways to irrigate. And that was so critical for the massive yield gains that you see later in the 60s and 70s and which are sustained to this day.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So,
and then the other thing,
in 2 or 3 years,
I just wanted to point out to everybody, I think you're going to say it, is how fast this collectivization happened, and it didn't come from above. The party didn't come down on the people to do it. The people came from the bottom and did it in like a year and a half or 2 years. It was incredible.
That's correct. And much of the party leadership actually vacillated. They were concerned, like, are we going too fast? It was not an issue that the party leadership agreed upon, and never really did up until Deng ended collectivization. At every stage of the collectivist movement, there was always disagreement within the party, and there's always discussion and debate happening at each and every stage. So, absolutely, that definitely should be recognized as something which the peasantry, this class, accomplished. No other class. It was their historical contribution.
Yeah, and it took the party by surprise. They were thinking it was going to take 5 or 10 years, and it took 2.
It's really incredible.
And so, is there anything else you would like to add to that before we move to the modern area?
That's a pretty good rundown of what happened to build to collectivization. I think, listen to your episode with Jinpings Han for how it was managed, right? What happened in the interluding 25 years? We can just skip to collectivization and what happened.
For the fans out there, that just gives you a good idea about how this was, how land went from being basically feudal, where you had semi-slave tenant farmers working on incredibly wealthy landowners' property in a feudal system. Then they went to privatized individual farming. Then they worked together with with each farmer's private after it had been distributed as fairly as possible across the country and village by village, in 1 million villages. And then they collectivized, pooled all their land, pooled all their tools, pooled all their machinery, pooled all their animals, draft animals, etc., and worked as a single unit. And so this went on until the decollectivization movement started in about 1980, right?
Yeah, I think 1978. There's some documents which Deng and his allies are putting out, which kind of hint that decollectivization is the direction of China. And then by 1981, 1982, there's on the ground real changes all across the nation. Yeah, and I think like if you want, I can give a quick rundown of what happened there.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I think like coming to the end of the 1970s, Mao passed away, and his successor was a weak, moderate, but still a Maoist figure by the name of Hua Guofeng. Mm-hmm. And Hua basically wanted to continue the policy of collectivization, wanted to continue the organization of the peasantry in the people's communes. But the general opinion that had formed by 1979, especially 1980, when Hua Guofeng is essentially replaced in all measures by Deng Xiaoping, was that people's communes were an obstacle to market socialism and the new strategy of industrialization, which was indeed opening up to the West, the free trade zones, all of that. These people's communes were recognized, I think very rightly, as obstacles to this, really in two ways. Firstly, they limited the ability of the peasantry to participate in the labor market. Yeah. Why is that so important? Because even at the beginning of the 1980s, almost 90% of China's population was still agrarian, was still counted as peasantry, and they were not able to go work in the factories, partially because of social obligation, right? You've lived in this village your entire life. You've been in this commune for 10, 20, almost 30 years now. You are expected as a member of that household to give certain labor contributions to certain village projects. You can't really then walk away all of a sudden and go work in this factory unless the government has arranged it. So there was, I think, political pressure, there was social pressure, but also there was an economic incentive to stay within that system. Everyone was guaranteed work. Everyone was guaranteed food. It was a situation, I think, described later as the iron rice bowl. Yeah. Right? So long as you participated in the commune, you had certain guarantees to healthcare, education, to food, to shelter, that you wouldn't have being part of a labor market in a city. So,
and so,
in order,
go ahead.
I think in order to proletarianize, in order to get the peasantry able to participate in these Western-led or cooperative ventures in industry in the cities, they needed to be removed from the commune. They needed to have the iron rice bowl essentially smashed. Yeah. Go on.
Okay, and so this happened progressively from the early 1980s and up until really today, and we'll talk at the end about current legislation, which is even more radical. But in the interim, there were a handful, what maybe 50, 100, I'm not sure, but around the country there were a certain number of villages that did not want to decollectivize, and they stayed collectivized. And about a year and a half ago, it was actually in September of 2018. Yeah, I read an article in the Chinese press about Xi Jinping telling the world. He gave a speech where he said that these collectivized farms, needed to be protected, and a group of farmers and business people from one of the villages came out with an announcement that went viral on social media here. And this is where you guys come in. You heard about the article. You heard about Xi, saying that they should not be forced to decollectivize. And tell us about going and seeing these villages and what you saw there.
Yeah, I think the important context here is since decollectivization, there are probably 4 types of economic organization in the countryside. The first is that small, independent household farming, kind of a blast of the past back to the early 50s, land to the tiller movement. And that probably makes up a good 10 to 20% of all the farm output in the country. But it is almost all subsistence farming. It's just enough to survive. And the farmers who do that typically have to go work a part-time job in the city somewhere just to get by.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, identified as the leading source of rural poverty. It's farmers being stuck in this situation since the decollectivization in the 80s. The second, I think, major kind of organization you see are the low-level co-ops, another blast to the past, back to the 50s, in the sense that these co-ops function just like a ag co-op would in France, in the Philippines, in Vietnam. You have member households, or member one vote, coming together and doing production and marketing together for the sake of participation in the market. I think this really has become the predominant form of organization in the countryside just in the last 10 years or so. Back in Hu Jintao's administration in 2007, there was a new law enacted called, I think it's called we put it in English. The Chinese is the 专业农民合作社. It's like the professional farmer co-op.
Yeah.
And with professional farmer co-op, the rules got a lot looser. Whereas before you need to have a lot of members, a lot of capital. Now the expectation is that you just have 5 farmers, no government employees allowed. It's a strict rule there. And you're willing to do production together, to have fair voting rules. That is, say each member gets to have a right in voting on organization, administration, etc. But beyond that, there really is no more rules. They've completely lowered the barriers to make them, and they've put a substantial amount of money into investing into them, right? So if you can make one of these cooperatives, you can get a good loan from the bank. You can get government investment, government cooperation, you name it. So just in the last 10, 12 years, they've gone on to become something like 40% of peasant households being represented within these cooperatives. They really have become the predominant form in China.
Oh, so there still are a lot of cooperative there still is a lot of cooperative farming then in China.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cooperative farming, but it's important to emphasize this is not the collectivist movement.
Yeah, I know.
And that people who are involved in the collectivist movement are very critical of the co-op. Mostly because, as we were talking back in the 50s, there was issues when it came to unfair competition. Basically, all of the vicissitudes of the market apply to a co-op. And recently there's been a problem with 1 or 2 families in the co-op, essentially, the ones who have most of the land and are getting dividends on their land, kind of make the big decisions and kind of get to play the leading role in organization and management, which is, I think, not favorable from the perspective of a collectivist farmer.
Okay. What are the other two forms of rural production?
One would be the specialized household farm. This is something which started back in the 1980s, and it's very similar to the large-scale family farms that you see in the United States. Basically, the village takes a large chunk of land, hundreds of mu or thousands of mu, and puts it into the ownership, you could say, of one household or 2 households. I should pause for a second and say, technically it's not the ownership which they possess, but the usufruct, right? They actually use the land, profit off of whatever comes from that land. But in essence, they get to operate these large-scale farms and employ for wages other villagers.
Okay.
This was seen as a very progressive thing in the 90s and as a way to let China develop its own version of family farming as we see it in the United States.
Okay, so they would do monoculture, tobacco or soybeans or flowers or something like that?
Not necessarily, but I think the economic activity they're engaged in is just as diverse as you'd see for a co-op.
Okay.
But they certainly have a better time when it comes to working with entrepreneurs in the city, right? They can present themselves as, I am the rural entrepreneur, I own this business, I own this land, and I can sign big contracts. So that's their competitive advantage, and that's their, I think, distinct niche, is these specialized farms. But the good news is, for us, there aren't very many of them. But the bad news is certain officials in certain places like them.
Yeah.
This is like the question of how to organize agriculture in China has not been settled, and there is much free discussion going on about it.
Yeah.
And like if you go and read like certain like party or organs, or like maybe I can include in the links here, like down in Zhejiang in particular, there's a lot of support for these specialized household farms. And some villages are kind of taken as like experimental sites where they try to get all the village land coordinated under these household farms and see what happens.
Huh. And what percent of the rural production would you say is that? You had 10% for the basically subsistence farming, 40% for small cooperatives, and then what percent do you think this is? Specialized farms.
I've never seen a statistic for it, but if I had to make an estimate, probably about 30%. And you see a lot more of them in the coastal provinces. So Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong are where I've seen them the most.
Okay. And what's left?
What's left are the collective economic organizations.
Okay, that you all visited.
Yeah, and like what these are like they're treated as business entities, right? So back up to decollectivization. When they started splitting up the land and the livestock and the seeds and the machinery, some stuff it didn't really make sense to be in the possession of one person or to be operated by one person. Famously, like things like, say, a gravel quarry or a tobacco processing plant didn't really make sense to go into the, like, how do you divide a factory, right? How do you divide a gravel quarry?
Yeah.
So these things remained in the possession of, what was once commune authority, but then became village or county authority. So it's a municipally owned or county owned enterprise, but everyone who has their hukou, everyone who has their residency in that village or county, technically has a collective share in that enterprise.
So the farmers, in these units, do they get dividends like from the village or county gravel quarry pit or tobacco processing plant?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They do some places, but there's still a lot of flexibility around how these are organized and how distribution happens. Some fans like recall back in the 1990s, there was something in China called the township enterprises.
Of course.
The village enterprises.
TVEs, Township Village Enterprises.
Yep, and under those, which never really exactly disappeared in some places, there was a lot more of, I would say, activity on the part of village residents, and they certainly were getting dividends in many places.
Okay.
So, but to answer your question, it's flexible. Some places, yes. Some places, unfortunately, no. Some places, they function almost as if it's a municipal enterprise back in America, where the county or the state runs this, and you just pay taxes for it.
Yeah, okay, got it. Now, how many villages or towns stayed collectivized back, from the 50s and or recollectivized in the interim? How many of them are there now?
Okay, so I have a statistic from Wang Xuecheng, who's like one of the big Chinese bloggers and writers who's into the collectivized movement. He was there with us when we did our trip to village. So what he had told me was there are 52 in the whole 52, country.
Okay, all right.
52 that he's aware of China.
What's gonna, so and you're. Well, I'll let the people who are listening read your magazine article where it just kind of explains it. I mean, there's a whole mixture of these collectivized villages and towns, and some of them are extremely successful, and then some do nothing, almost do practically only small industry. And not much farming at all. Just tell us a little bit about Haoxi and how maybe one or two guys or the town's kind of dependent on these one or two benefactors and where you see this heading, for the collectivized farms.
Sure. So like taking Haoxi as an example, I think we should recognize it as maybe a semi-collectivized village. So as opposed to places like Nanjie or I believe it's called or Haoxi in Jiangsu province, most of the employment, income, and I would say land use is not really being done collectively yet, but they're pushing towards it. They began their collectivization push in 2011 under the leadership of the party secretary there, who's named he's named Zheng Liqian. This is the guy who penned the 2016 proposal.
Yeah, that I read.
Yeah. This is the guy who really made this all happen. He wrote the proposal. You read the proposal. I saw your show, and then it was I was calling all the phone numbers listed on that proposal. Yeah, there was 18 cadres who signed that. I called all 18. One picked up. Once I told him what I wanted to do, he was like, "No, don't come." And then the other 16 just didn't pick up the phone. But then when I called Zheng Liqian, he was the last guy I called. When I called Zheng, he at first had me send him a text message, explain what I wanted, then added my WeChat. And then after a couple exchanges on there, invited me to the village to do this interview and to make this whole report possible. Kudos to him. He made this all work.
It's really an amazing story. And so what's really got me worried about, is I understand, that she came out and gave this speech, about the time. I think it was pretty much in response to these people's, to Zheng's call, and to not force the collectivized, these 52 collectivized villages and to decollectivize. And she actually came out, the president of the country came out and said these people are not to be, touched. And he kind of alluded to the fact that they might serve as a model for future socialist development and the eventual Datong a utopian communist society they're working for towards the hopefully there's talking 2049 and thereafter, etc. Then there's all this current legislation being proposed by the national, as I understand it, and I'd like to get clarification. They're going to basically go back and they're going to start offering land rights to the farmers where they actually own the dirt. Is that true?
It's definitely in an ambiguous position. All the legislation currently being discussed is in the draft form. In 2020, they're going to have the next update to the civil code. So next year, we'll figure out the result of these discussions. But in essence, basically house rights, so residential places will become, in essence, property. Your usufruct will no longer be limited to 70 years or 100 years. It will permanently be up to the owner to pass it on in their family indefinitely, which is a big change from, I think, previous Chinese policy.
Well, it's just, even Deng Xiaoping said that, we will never abandon, control of the resources, and to privatize property, that would be basically going to capitalism.
That is correct. But I do have some friends who are supporters of some Chinese friends who are really into, I think, Xi Jinping thought. And their rationale for this is the important pieces of property are not residential homes. They're the means of production. They're factories, they're docks. These things need to be public. But someone's home, so long as it's not producing value other than personal value, doesn't need to stay public.
Okay. It just seems to me. It seems to me like the 70-year lease is working great. I don't know why the long-term lease is working great. I'm a little bit sorry. It's almost like, you are more informed than I am, but it's almost like once you pull your finger out of the dike, it's like, where do you stop? That's what's worrisome about it.
Yeah, I think you're aware that property speculation is a problem right now in China.
Yeah, terrible.
And the government is doing their best to take care of that, but property prices are incredibly high. And I think, but for most Chinese people, one of their biggest goals in life is to own a home. I think that was certainly true of like previous generations of Americans. Perhaps not for us, but in China right now, it's still all about car ownership and home ownership. Everyone wants to have one.
Yeah, I definitely have. I've encountered that with people I've talked to living here. It's even like passive conversations with people my own age here talk about like owning a.
85% of the Chinese own real estate, with the 70-year lease, of course.
Yeah, but it's important to recognize a lot of that statistic is like these countryside homes or even these urban homes in the cities were granted. They were built, by the state or with state investment and given to people who were displaced by the migration from the countryside.
Exactly. Yeah. So 2020. So what do you think is going to happen? Are they going to allow residential property to be privatized in perpetuity?
It's hard to say what's being discussed, but the amount of support for the idea that you see coming out in like official press leads me to believe that they'll probably do something in that way. I'm sure it will be a measured approach. It will be something which they talk through and think through.
Yeah.
But we'll see what.
I always tell people about Chinese democracy. It's very consultative. It's very consensual, and it's very there's always, everybody thinks it's some kind of, totalitarian, Orwellian, command thing, but there's actually a huge amount of discussion, debate, social media. People can contact their city hall. They get invited to come in and, tell them what they think about this and that. And so there will be, I know, a huge amount of discussion, and among all the people who want to get involved around the country.
Yep. So I think that's where that is. But with the question you mentioned before, like with the where does the official position fall when it comes to these collective villages? I think it's absolutely true that Xi Jinping and others have stated that these villages and collective farming and collective land rights in general need to remain. Although they make up a big part of the economic output in the countryside, it's a rather small amount of arable land that remains in collective ownership and collective use. Most of what these collective economic enterprises are things like trash collection, they're paving roads, they're building apartment blocks, gravel quarries, coal mines, you name it. Yeah. It's not really about farmland. But despite that, a couple of years ago, I think that they're capping it at about 1%. And in the years that have passed since they made that requirement, we're slipping closer and closer to 1%. I think that declaration was made in 2014, 2015. And in the 4 years that have passed since then, we've slipped from about 2 or 3% to somewhere closer to 1%.
That are fully collectivized, like back in the late 50s.
I think how they're counting this is just like land which arable land that A exists and B is not in some private hand. You get a cooperative, you get a specialized home, you get a producer. So that's what they're looking at mathematically. Okay. Yeah,
I heard a figure of 2%, but you're saying it's actually going down. So this is all very interesting, and it's just China. Everybody thinks that China is just some sort of monolithic, totalitarian, faceless bureaucracy. But no country in modern history has implemented so many experiments and policies and tried so many different ways to take care of their people, and it's admirable. It really is. And since it is socialist communist, of course, the West has to try to destroy it and crash it and badmouth it and talk about what a huge failure it is. And so it's just and the fact that they are collective farms are apparently going to be around at least as a model for the future, and they're trying this, they're trying that. I am a little bit worried about if they privatize the dirt on residential property, but But if that happens, that happens. They know a lot more about it than I do and have a lot more understanding of Chinese, economics and than I do for sure. So we'll see what happens.
And I think something.
Go ahead.
Go on.
Go ahead.
I think something which all of the communists and socialists can relish in around the world is the existence of places in China, these collectivist villages, these villages which have a high degree of employment and land use in collective ownership, is like the absolute success of places like Nianjie Village in Henan or Haoxi Village in Jiangsu. The standard of living in these villages is far beyond any market or private-oriented village in China. They have free housing, they have free healthcare, they have free education up through college. They are so successful, and going to these spaces, being in a place where socialism is thriving, is so, I think, so verifying. It is so validating as a communist. So I think I encourage anyone living abroad or within China to go to these places and see firsthand.
I'll put the names of them in the article, and any links you want to send me, I'd love to, Chinese or English. I'd love to see them. So, what are your all's future China projects, Alex and John?
So after, oh my goodness, sorry. So after this interview that we had set up with you, the next big thing that Alex and I are going to work on is we're going to be doing a film survey of Korean cinema, both North and South, as well as Chinese and Japanese, to kind of compare the different relationships.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah,
amazing.
Especially, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this upcoming project. It's going to be talking a lot about. Well, some of the work I did in the past was about films as commodity, and it's going to be super interesting to watch and commentate on films that are produced in socialist, communist governments.
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
So kind of comparing, yeah, going on like maybe not a year-by-year basis, but on perhaps a decade-by-decade sort of thing. But yeah, it's very much in the work, but it's something that we're both looking forward to committing more time to and focusing on more directly.
Cool. And I want to plug, Alex, do you want to add anything to that? Do you have any other projects?
I mean, yes, I do. I think the side gig you alluded to earlier, One River Tea, is a great work of practice.
Everybody buy their tea from One River Tea. I'll put the www.onerivertea.com. Buy from Alex and help him develop his business here in China and help Chinese tea farmers.
Yep. So what we've done there is we've gone to these co-ops and household farms, not specialized household farms, like the independent producers as well as co-ops throughout 3 provinces in China. We've bought their tea, we've got it packaged in some nice sleek boxes, and it's ready to be sent abroad. So any tea drinkers out there, I encourage you to check it out.
I'm going to order some.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the support.
Hey, well, listen, you guys are amazing. You know, when I sit there and I see, most guys your age, they're playing video games and they're watching the NBA, playoffs, and they're, watching the newest Spider-Man or, Iron Man movie or whatever, and they're just wrapped up in, being entertained by eye candy, and you guys are just. And they're they're getting their news from CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, and to sit there and see you guys just really trying to make a difference at such a young age is very hopeful for me and gives me some optimism about the fact that we can fight the bastards who. The global capitalism, and that we can all make a difference, even though it took me until I was 55 to finally figure it out. Anyway, hopefully for those of you listening out there, Alex and John will give you the courage to maybe step out of the mainstream and out of the the matrix, as they call it, and try to make a difference in the world. So thank you guys so much for being on the show, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
And the next time I'm back in China, I'd love to come and visit you guys.
You're always welcome.
That would be incredible, Jeff.
All right, let's stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.